Hello, I'm Patricia Gras. Welcome to Passion Time. I'm here with Courtney Reynolds. She's with Bo's Place, and she will tell us what that's about, but it's dealing with grief. Now, Courtney is a licensed master of social work, and first we're going to start by asking you, how did you find your passion in doing this kind of work with grief?
Well, I've always known I wanted to do stuff with grief and kids, and grief is not something that's easy for people to talk about, and grief and difficult topics has always been something that's just kind of been something I've been easily able to sit with people from a young age all the way through high school and college. And so I've always been a girl that known I wanted to be a therapist and known that grief was kind of my path. It was just finding a way, how do I get there? And so I've taken my path all the way to Bo's Place.
How did you understand grief at such a young age? Did something happen to you, or you just could understand, could sit with it?
Grief happened around me, but not in a intense way to me until I was kind of older in high school. But I think it was something that coping skills was really important in my family, and a support network and building a friend support network was really important, and those things aren't frequently taught in families. So that was something that I knew was important, and I knew had to be instilled or should be suggested to other people.
Yeah. Now, there's all kinds of loss. There's sudden loss and there's expected loss, like expected when you have an older parent and you've been taking care of them, and all of a sudden you know they're going to die because they're old. But when you have a sudden loss, for example, the loss of a child, how are these types of losses differently, and how do you grieve differently with these losses?
So with sudden loss, you don't expect it. You're not really able to prepare, so those just kind of feel so
shocking.
Yeah, and you think about the what ifs. What could I have done differently? Was there something I could have prepared for, especially if it's something like suicide, or did something go wrong? If you're not really sure what happened, if there's something that has to do with autopsy results, or was there drugs involved, anything like that. But when there's expected, whether it's age or whether it's medical, a lot of people kind of get into that caregiver role, and it's really hard to, and not everybody does this, but a lot of people get in that caregiver role, and it's hard to take advantage of those emotional moments.
Right.
It's hard to actually kind of live in we're going to really take advantage of this time that we have together, and we got to get done X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And so after the fact, I wish we'd had these conversations, or I wish we had just done this together. And for child loss, it goes against the grain of time. You expect to see them do all these wonderful things, and you expect to see the older generation die before you, but then your younger generation dies.
Right.
And why?
It's difficult.
Very why.
So would you say one's harder than the other?
Not necessarily. They're just so different. You can't really prepare for one. People try to prepare for death or grief or traumatic events.
And you can't.
And it's just something that you can't explain until you've experienced it yourself. That's why knowing other people who have gone through it are so important.
What works though? I mean, Bo's Place, tell me the story of Bo's Place. Bo's Place is it was a child who died, and the parents decided to
it first started as an information referral line, and then we started offering grief support groups. So it started as just children and families coming, and then now we have adult programs. So for young adults, and we have a pregnancy loss group, and now we have a 3 and 4 year old group, and we also have Spanish speaking family groups. So the whole premise is getting help from your peers, being able to relate to someone else who gets it.
Does that seem to work best when you can't understand loss until you've lost someone, and then or a job, or we'll talk about that too, but to really help someone?
Yes, because even the families that call, their other family members seem to think they should be over it by a certain amount of time. 6 months later, they're like, why aren't you better?
Right, you're supposed to get over it. Get over it.
Yeah.
And you can't. And you agree with the 7 stages of grief, the Kubler-Ross? At first, shock, denial, and then do the stages always work that way, or it varies?
I think it definitely varies. And she even said herself later in life that she never meant for those stages to be attributed to grief. It was more like in her working with people who were dying, that those were typical stages that she saw. we see that grief is definitely a universal experience that people have with grief, and there are some universal things that people feel, but it's a very unique experience.
Right, and it's very personal.
I mean, adults, it's very consuming. I mean, you have a lot of somatic physical symptoms where you feel like headaches, you get the dreams, you can't sleep, you have all the emotions, anger, sadness, and guilt. With kids, it's in spurts. I mean, they feel it, they want to hang out with their friends, they go to school, and then they get angry, and parents wonder why they're angry and don't behave at home, but really that's part of grief in itself.
Wow.
There's a lot of bullying that happens. I mean, you can't play with us because you don't have a dad, and we wonder why in the world that would happen at school, but it does.
But it does. Kids are mean.
They are.
How do adults and children grieve differently?
So like I said, kind of the body systems view for adults is an easy way to understand how adults can kind of grieve. So physical, they get lots of headaches, got a lot of body weakness, lots of sleep problems, emotionally, anger, confusion, guilt, loneliness. Cognitively, it's hard to concentrate, it's hard to focus on things. They start idealizing the person who died, even if they had lots of negative experiences with them. Spiritually, either they turn to their faith or away. And then socially, they isolate, or they become really passive, or they become really aggressive.
Wow. Okay.
Whereas even infants, they can be really fussy, or they can have trouble feeding, and they can have trouble sleeping. And young kids, they don't understand death. They think, okay, dad died. Okay, well, when's he coming home? And then young children about 5 to 9, they understand death, but they don't think it can happen to them. And they fear you're going to forget them. But kids around 9 to 11, they use humor, and then they start feeling more guilty where maybe I said something mean to dad, so I made him die.
Are kids more resilient than adults when it comes to death or to major loss?
It's not necessarily resilience, but they take on just as much ownership as the adults. They start to take kind of like the covert parent role. They'll try to take care of the parent, even though the parent's trying to take care of the kids just as much as them. And they'll try to be strong for the kids, but the kids are doing the exact same thing.
What do you think what is the difference between, for example, we always say, okay, loss, you think it's a person, but a loss of a job, a loss of a position, a loss of your country, of your livelihood or your life is a major loss as well. How are those different when you're dealing with, a person dying versus all these other types of losses I just mentioned?
I mean, I think you can have a lot of those similar reactions, like I mentioned, especially in adults. Those are so under-recognized. I mean, grief is very under-recognized, and it's a very avoided topic. When you start talking about it, people look the other way and they don't kind of want to talk about it because it's just so uncomfortable. And they're not comfortable with the fact that they're going to die someday. We can't avoid it. That negative things happen to us, and with that usually comes grief or negative emotions. And so all of those other types of grief that usually we don't have support services for, or that aren't as recognized, it's just as uncomfortable. And so people don't want to talk about them because they're taboo topics. And while we don't necessarily have a network in place at both places to give support to those, we try as hard as we can to make grief a comfortable topic to talk about, to do what we can to help on the grief side of loss, on the death grief side of loss.
Have you found that over, say time heals all wounds? Is that really true, or what does time do to grief?
I believe that grief is a journey, and you can't really predict an end to it. That there's typically, grief has these negative, it's got a negative rep.
Okay.
And grief has a lot of negative emotions that you feel at the beginning, and it's really intense, and there's lots of waves up and down. But eventually the waves and hills are slower, and you start feeling hope and laughter and joy and happiness, and you can start finding ways to incorporate that person in a meaningful way, and you start feeling their presence and their meaning to you just as strong but different. And sometimes you're going to have a really huge wave and it's going to be a really sucky day, but it's still going to be mostly good emotions.
So thank you, Courtney, for joining us. And if you are grieving and you need some help, you need to check their website, bosplace.org. And we'll see you next time on Passion Time.
Yo sé que tú puedes, que tú eres capaz. Cambia tu vida. La vida es una y tú vas a triunfar. Cambia tu vida. Con fe y esperanza, las puertas